Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Joshua Swearingen. I am with TUSK Practice Sales, and this evening we're going to discuss your plastic surgery M&A market update moving into the 2024 market. As an agenda for this evening, we'll cover introductions briefly, and then we'll deep dive into healthcare consolidation, kind of a historical overview and how some of the other verticals within healthcare have consolidated via private equity backing over the last 10, 15, 20 years. We'll be covering private equity and venture-backed funding, how they operate and what they're looking for in your business, the future of plastic surgery, and some things to be considering in 2024 and moving forward as it relates both to your practice and the market as a whole. My name is Josh Swearingen, and I've had the opportunity to operate within healthcare for going on 20 years now. The first portion of my career, I was within the dentistry space, both selling and distributing to private practicing dentists, and then ultimately operating, running, and selling a large group practice to a private equity-backed dental service organization. I've worked in mergers and acquisitions for large national corporate entities, and then I've also had the opportunity to work on the sell side, as I do now with TUSK, representing sellers out in the market space who are looking to find the right partner at the right price in the right timeline. On the side, I'm also the founder and co-owner of Reverse Aesthetics, which is a premier aesthetics and med spa organization within the Central Ohio market. I'm very passionate about this space, not just med spas, but also dermatology and plastic surgery, and believe that there's a significant runway moving into the future for growth, especially with private equity now entering the landscape. TUSK Practice Sales is comprised of 14 team members currently. We have well over 120 years of healthcare experience. Some of us were investment bankers, some of us were M&A, some of us were executive leaders within our organizations, and we've all combined that experience to build an organization that is very customer-centric and built around helping to run a successful process for you and your business. To date, we've closed just north of $1 billion in healthcare deals, comprised primarily of a little over 200 various transactions. As we talk about kind of the breadth of experience that we have, coming up on the left side, you have a tremendous amount of finance, investment banking, private equity, mergers and acquisitions for organizations across a broad spectrum of verticals, both healthcare and outside of healthcare. In addition to our vast financial backgrounds, we've also operated largely in the healthcare space within several different verticals in a lot of different capacities, ranging from executive leadership to sales to software as a service development, and just about everything in between. So we've seen a lot of these entities from all different sides, and we're very, very well versed in operating within both a financial environment driven by private equity and venture capital, and a healthcare environment driven by a consolidating marketplace that relies on organizations like us to help streamline the sales process with individual sellers like yourselves. So let's talk a little bit about historical consolidation within plastic surgery, but then I also want to compare and contrast that to where we are with a couple of different verticals that we have some experience in, just to give you maybe a little bit of insight into where we think this market's going based on what's happened in the past. So if we look at where we stand now, medical consolidation, which everyone is aware of, has tipped the board at roughly 85% consolidated. When we talk about medical consolidation, it's important to understand that consolidation covers a large myriad of different types of buyers and sellers. And medical is a good example because you had different stages of consolidation where you had group practices forming, and then you had larger groups buying smaller groups, and then you had larger and larger groups merging to form these super groups. And then ultimately where we ended up is you have universities and hospital systems essentially purchasing all of the private practices and groups that are in the space. Moving up, as we take a step back and we look at kind of the next industry in line, let's talk about dental consolidation. And all estimates indicate that dentistry is consolidated at roughly a 30 to 35% range. Now, it's really difficult to get into exactly what the numbers are because everyone delineates consolidation in groups and who's backing who a little bit differently. But most of the analysts in dentistry believe that it's around 30 to 35% consolidated. And that is representative of the groups that are backed by private equity or venture capital. It's important to note that you will also have a significant percentage of the dental population that are consolidating, but they are consolidated under private practice ownership or bank funding or things like that, which is a little bit different. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And as we move on and we discuss plastic surgery, all estimates indicate that plastic surgeons are consolidating at roughly a 7 to 10% rate. And again, the numbers are ranging because the definitions range a little bit, but we peg it right around 7 to 10%, which really, if you look at the timelines that are represented here, places it, I don't know, probably 10 or so years behind where dentistry is today, 10, maybe 15 years behind where dentistry is currently operating. So as you start to put together timelines in your head and working through valuations and things like that, which we can certainly help you do, it's important to understand what that runway is and help time out optimally when you want to start thinking about exiting ownership of your business as it relates to either wealth creation or retirement or numerous other things that you have to think through within your personal life. So what are some of the driving forces specifically for plastic surgery? Well, I think it's a very scalable business model, which is important to understand. You can build out a site and you can build out a central services organization that can manage some of those sites. And it makes it remarkably easy for a corporately backed entity to manage multiple businesses that are within striking distance of a comparable business model, which is essentially what most of these private equity groups are looking for. They would like to build out a management entity that can help manage multiple practices and streamline some of those operational aspects. And then ultimately, the hope is that they will leave the clinical care to the doctors that are within that plastic surgery practice. In addition to that, consumer loyalty is huge, and this is only growing in scale. When we talk about consumer loyalty, as a plastic surgeon, you may only do one procedure once for a patient, but if you do a procedure for a patient and you do a good job, when they have other procedures they have that they are planning, they're likely going to come back to you. In addition, we're now seeing more and more blending of the lines between plastic surgery and med spa space because plastic surgeons are now integrating a lot of those monthly and every 6 week and every 6 month procedures into their service offerings, which are bringing patients back more and more, and also adding profitability to the bottom line of these plastic surgery practices. We have significant projected market growth over the next 10 to 15 years. And I think one of the drivers for that market growth is the decreasing age of consumers. Plastic surgery, med spa in particular, those two verticals used to be for women, middle-aged women, from 40 to 55 years of age. And that has now been completely changed over the last 5 to 10 years as we've seen a huge uptick in men who are receiving care, both from plastic surgeons and med spas. And then also the mean age of the consumer is dropping dramatically as we start to see younger and younger patients in their early 20s to mid 20s begin receiving care early on. That is both preventative and aesthetic in nature, but will likely last the entire life of that patient. So we're seeing the average patient value skyrocket through the roof, which is driving a lot of this growth. And as you can see, we're currently sitting in roughly a $46 billion plastic surgery market. It's anticipated to more than double over the next few years, which is always going to be a calling card for private equity to get involved. They get very excited about numbers like this in a market that is growing as rapidly as plastic surgery is. I think it would be helpful to understand what the average consolidation life cycle looks like for a specific vertical. Phase one, which is to some extent where plastic surgery is, I would say that I mentioned that plastic surgery is roughly what 7 to 10, 11% consolidated. Once you start getting into that 10% range, you start to see a tipping point within the space. And as we talk about phase one in platform development, really these are large multi-site groups. So you're looking at $2 to $5 million in EBITDA, which is basically a baseline profitability measurement. Reasonable synergies between practices. Hopefully there's some infrastructure in place. And what the private equity groups are looking for essentially is a functioning, profitable business that they can build around. So it's a little bit difficult to do that around one primary location, but if you have 4 or 5 or 6 in a given geographic area and your EBITDA is hitting that 2 to 5 year range, you'll have a lot of private equity groups that will be interested in taking you on as their platform and essentially building around you as the initiator of their group. And if we move on to phase 2, that would be infrastructure and growth. And that phase 2 is, I would say, plastic surgery is at the front end of that. Dentistry is well into that segment of it. And phase 2 is really focused on private practices. And you initially have these platforms that get built around the country, and then their goal is to grow. And the primary way to do that is to add private practices here and there and left and right and wherever they can find them and fold those underneath their umbrella. So you start to see valuations raise, you start to see opportunities for single location practitioners arise. And this is really where we start to see generational wealth being created within the private practicing market. The keys to this, be running a healthy private practice. If you have a good location that's been reasonably updated, operates well, 250 to 2 million in EBITDA, that can be folded into a larger platform reasonably easily, that is optimal for these groups. And when I say can be folded into a larger platform easily, what I'm referring to is if you get too highly specialized in the space, it becomes a little bit more difficult to find a buyer that is comfortable integrating that business in. So if you're focusing on one particular procedure and you're the best at it, that's great. It may be a little bit difficult to find a buyer for you, or there may be fewer that come to the table for that. However, if you're a middle of the fairway location that is reasonably generalist in nature, there will be a significant market for your business moving forward. And then finally, we get into management service organization, medical service organization, full consolidation. And this is kind of where the tipping point hits, and medical is well into this, dentistry is approaching this, but that's 40% plus consolidated. And the reason that's such a significant tipping point is because for several years, a 7 to 10 year window, you've got a huge focus on private practices that are being purchased by these recently formed platforms. Well, at some point, many of those platforms need a little bit more gas in the fire to keep their growth going. So looking at one-off single locations becomes less desirable, and they start to really focus on acquiring other smaller platforms. So you may have a large management service organization or medical service organization that is out there that has 70 locations, and they may not be looking at a single location, but they are looking at a group of 5 locations because that moves the needle for them with their investment committee. So you start to see within this space a little bit of a devaluing of the private practices as these larger groups begin to kind of gobble each other up to grow, to make significant strides in their growth curve. So obviously, who does this benefit? Well, it benefits those mid-tier groups. So if you're a large group and you're looking at acquiring a smaller group, maybe 15 million EBITDA, 20 locations, things of that nature, this is where your value kind of hits the top of the ladder. So something to be cognizant of as you're growing. If you're already a 6, 7, 10 location group, I would highly recommend that you go through our TUSK process. We'll run some basic analytics on your business, give you an idea of where we believe your market value will be based on the composition of your business and the EBITDA that you bring to the table. Those are all calculations that we'll run. And that'll give you enough information to decide if you want to cut ties and look at going to market now. If you want to focus on growing and getting into that kind of second tier or third tier in consolidation, 7, 8, 10 years down the road. But any way you look at it, it's helpful information and it's free of charge. We're happy to provide it for you. So consolidation expectations. Well, within the plastic surgery market, one location or so, that represents about 80% of the market right now. And we anticipate in the next 5 years, you're going to see a decline of private practices by roughly 20% down to 60% of the market. Those mid-market 20 to 25 locations should see a reasonably substantive growth to 25% of the market in that same 5 years. And then the elite groups, 25 locations or more, currently at around 5% of the market. We see a similar 10% jump in that space to 15% of the market. And that's where we think this will flush out over the next 3 to 5 years. So a couple of key takeaways from this. Private equity interest in plastic surgery practices is going to remain incredibly high. There are too many things going on in this space to ignore the potential financial upside benefit that a private equity sponsor or a venture capital sponsor can help drive and experience for their investors. So fight it all you want, it's not going away, and it's going to provide record levels of wealth for those private practice owners and sellers who are prepared for it. We are basically entering the golden age of private practice ownership within plastic surgery. We can go back a couple of slides and talk about where that tipping point is, but once you hit about 10 or 12% consolidated, which is where we are in plastic surgery, that's when valuations for private practices start to skyrocket. Competition for those practices skyrockets, which further helps drive those valuations, and generational wealth can be created for the sellers who are prepared and ready to go. The buyers are going to be very aggressive. They will try to keep the purchasing environment free of competition. You'll hear this in many other industries. We are just now starting to hear this term within the plastic space, but we talk a lot in the mergers and acquisitions markets about unsolicited offers. And unsolicited offers are essentially when someone sends a letter to your practice or sends you an email or walks in and says, hey, I'd like to buy your practice. Here's how we would value it. Here's your offer. You didn't solicit it. You didn't go out looking for it. And in many cases, when the buyer controls the entire environment, you may end up getting a really nice dog and pony show and seeing all the bells and whistles that they can offer within a letter of intent. But it's hard to determine if any of those are attainable. And quite frankly, you have no idea if the offer they're giving you is even up to market, simply because there's no additional competition in the buying field. So I think one of the things that we talk about at TUSK all the time is, the unsolicited offers are nice. Someone's taken notice in your practice. They're interested in it. That's great. But you owe it to yourself to run a competitive process and ensure that there are multiple buyers that are taking a look at your practice, putting a valuation on your practice, and helping to determine, what the important factors are in selling your business. Because in many cases, a single buyer may come with the highest offer, but there may be other parts of that deal that you really don't like, or other parts of the organization that you don't like. Similarly, you may have an organization that is aligned perfectly with your goals and is perfectly set up for the type of business that you have and provides a tremendous runway long-term for your equity value, but they may come with a slightly discounted offer. And being able to be educated and understand how to navigate those waters is critically important. All right, I just want to thank you for your time this evening. It's always great to speak to groups all around the country and doctors on the phone and in person and discuss kind of where the marketplace is going. I am incredibly excited about where the space is. I'm excited to see how this impacts some of your lives, both in the short term and the long term. And as I mentioned previously, Josh with TUSK Practice Sales, you're welcome to reach out to me, ask any questions that you like, and we'd be happy to produce a practice valuation at no cost to yourself at any point if you're contemplating what your business might be worth or what your future options are. So thanks again for your time this evening. Have a great night.